As you maybe can tell, if you've been listening to the last few episodes, I have been giving a lot of time lately to the idea of thriving in the messy middle of life. I've noticed that over time, a lot of us have unrealistic expectations for ourselves, for the way we are, quote unquote, supposed to feel or react or be in a certain situation. And then what happens is we get really angry at ourselves when we don't meet those expectations. I want to spend some time on the idea that we can live in a world of nuance, in a world where both feeling sad or angry and joyful or at peace can exist at the same time. We are made up of multitudes, and it's time we start giving ourselves permission to live that way. So I wonder, can we find wonder in the weeds of life? So lately, the last few weeks, I have really been in the aftermath of the hurricanes, Helene and then Milton, mostly because seeing all the devastation and the surprise of some of it and just the totality of the loss has brought me right back to all the feelings that I had and that we collectively shared after Superstorm Sandy decimated the Jersey Shore. It's a little bit different. We had a little more understanding of the effects leading up to it, so people were able to get out. The human loss wasn't as drastic, but the loss was as drastic, and the scope of the loss was, something I had never ever experienced before. And I think something the world had not, the world that I live in had not experienced before. Again, it was a 100-year storm. So I know for a fact that it was an unprecedented event. And while my family was only mildly affected, we lost our power for a few weeks. There was a fire at a light pole outside of our home. It affected us, but it was not prolonged. It wasn't 6, 8, 10 months of our lives. It was, a month in the immediate aftermath. And that wasn't easy, but it also wasn't the same as some of my neighbors and friends and other people up and down the coast who just had full devastation and took sometimes years to recover from, if they recovered at all from it. So my involvements in the aftermath were really in the places that I loved, the beach town that we went to, the towns where my friends lived, the places just a few miles away from me, those were decimated in the storm. And so one of the things that helped me was to help and go and physically be in those areas and help with some of the cleanup and rebuilding. And it was actually that was the sort of impetus for me to go back to graduate school to be a therapist. So after Helene, I spent a lot of time absorbing all of the information that I could from everybody I could, from the people, from the places, from those friends that I actually know in places like Asheville and Florida, and then also anything I could get my hands on, news and social media wise about it. I actually have a fellow therapist in Nashville. And she was a mentor to me when I first started my private practice. She runs an organization where she mentors a lot of us in running our private practice and sort of helps us to be therapists who also have lives outside of the office. And I follow her religiously anyway, but I was really sort of invested in her updates on Instagram once she got back to being able to do that, because in those first few days, she was, again, devastated, but not quite to the scope of some of the other parts of her town. I know her mother lost her office, her studio space in the downtown Asheville area, and they didn't have power, they didn't have water, they didn't have a lot of things, but she was able to kind of keep us updated because they were largely safe, at least. And while much of their lives had been destroyed, or at the very least upended, they had few moments where she could find time to update us. And in those updates, there was one in particular that kind of hit me, which was this what she called a glimmer. It was a moment in time where she was finding something, amidst the proverbial rubble of her life that helped it all feel a little less bleak. Some warm moment, some joyful event, some person who shed a little light on an otherwise dark situation. She was pointing those out, probably mostly for her, but it helped the rest of us too. And it really got me thinking about resilience and this idea that we have to live alongside tragedies and trials of life sometimes if we're really going to fully live a full human experience. So I want to tell you a little story. I know I've already talked about my involvement with Hurricane Sandy, or Superstorm Sandy as it was, but I also want to talk about early on in my married/new mom life. I was pregnant with my second child. I had to think. Because my first pregnancy wasn't great either. There were some things that happened then too. But my second child, so it was 2003, 2004, I guess, we had a lot happening. I had just changed jobs. Soon into when I began my new job, my husband was let go from his job. I was pregnant. My mother's cancer was back. We had, a 2-year-old in the house, and there was a lot of uncertainty in our future. There was a lot of stress in our present. We were really sort of taxed as a couple and as individuals, just kind of trying to find our next right way through. And I don't remember if it was an article that my husband read or if I saw it or if it was a news story or what, but there was, I think in my brain, it's a Life or a Time magazine article. I'm not sure if that's true, so I don't want to give them credit, but it was a story talking about like sort of the top 5 stressors on a couple, really. And they were, and I'll tell you what they are in a sec, but I know that we read it and we went, oh my God, at that moment when we were reading it, we have 4 of the 5 going on right now. And then pretty quickly we lost my mom. And so her cancer won and she lost that battle and we lost my mom. And so then we had all 5. We had all 5 stressors currently at the same exact time. And those stressors are death of a loved one, moving to a new home. Oh, because in the midst of all that, I forgot to tell you that in the midst of all that, when my husband got a job, we had to move. Illness or injury of self or loved one. So, my mother was sick at the beginning, died at the end. A job loss, a job change. Those were, and then divorce is a 6th one. So job loss, new job, illness or injury, moving, death, and then divorce is sort of the 6th stressor, which, we didn't get there, but I can understand how people do. I remember in that moment thinking, oh my gosh, how will we survive this? But also like, how are we surviving this? Why aren't we kind of succumbing to all of these 5 things? And then really what I was thinking was, oh, are we just going to have to hold our breath and suffer through and wait for the calm that comes after this storm before we get to feel good again? Like, are we just going to be constantly in this state of bracing ourselves until all of these things change? We get a different job, we move, the baby's born, my mother's funeral's over. Like, I don't know, like, is there a thing that we have to wait for in order to feel okay again? And if so, how do we keep just from going down with the ship at that time? How do we not drown in all of this? And are we allowed to feel good in it? And I think back to Allison's Glimmers. Objectively speaking, it was one of the worst times probably in any of those humans' lives after the storm that had completely ripped through the towns that they knew and loved. And yet she was able to find these moments of goodness. And not only were the moments of goodness there, but she gave herself permission to take a minute and feel them. And also, I would imagine being able to feel them helped sort of pull her through some of the darker moments. I know that's how it was for me. When I went over to these towns to help the rebuilding, not on purpose, I wasn't intentional at the time, but I did notice the way that people were getting along with each other, the incredible response and quickness of the National Guard to show up and just sort of, create this whole scenario where we could help clean, the generosity of other people who poured in with, Clorox wipes and all of the things that people asked for. I was able to take that in along with the total devastation that I was witnessing as well. The tears from the families that were, had passed these homes down generation after generation and they were just gone. There was so much sadness. And yet I could also catch some of the glimmers and the goodness that was there as well. And I know that helped me through. It also inspired a whole new career, but that's a story for another day. So when I work with people, I find that there's this common belief, whether it's conscious or not, that when life is hard, that's it. That's what you get to feel. You get to feel that it's hard, or You're not allowed to say that it's hard. That's the thing that I see people do. They either say, well, all this stuff is happening, so I guess I'm just going to have to be miserable. Or all this stuff is happening, but I can't admit that I'm miserable because that's wrong too. Nowhere in there is there room for just goodness or happiness or even permission to feel the feelings, the authentic feelings of what the time calls for. Somehow, like, you just got to get through the tough stuff and then you're able to live a full life. That somehow resilience just means surviving it all so that you can go back to what was before. That's actually kind of the definition of resilience, is that withstanding or recovering quickly from a tragedy or loss. And I really want to challenge that definition. I'm not going to take it all the way to the dictionary, folks, but I want to challenge it here with you. This idea that resilience simply means either withstanding something so brutal, you survive it, or you recover really quickly from something so brutal that you barely survived it. I'm not saying that those aren't resilient things. I just want to challenge that as a narrow definition because it makes it seem like we have to wait for smooth sailing in life in order to feel good. And I don't know about you, but I'm not sure I've ever strung together consecutive months, much less years of smooth sailing. So does that mean that I only get to feel good for little tiny bursts of time? Or I'm not allowed to feel good during those rough patches or rough times? And more importantly, am I not even allowed to acknowledge how rough they are? Is the alternative supposed to like spin it so that it's all positive all the time? My goal is not either or, happy, sad, angry, peaceful, dark and light. That's not my goal. My goal is somewhere in all of that, in the darkness and the light, in the happiness and the sadness, in the anger and the peace, that I learn to live in the center of it all. I'm going to skew one way or the other some days, but largely, can I find the center lane between the two, alley gutters on either side? Because acting as if everything's happy all the time and not acknowledging the hardness and the sadness, that doesn't actually make me happy. And getting stuck in the sadness and thinking I can only feel this way until this part is over, that doesn't move me toward the other side. So instead, I wonder if resilience can mean that we have the ability to find the glimmers on the dark end and really absorb the goodness on the other side, and then use those as life preservers during the storm so that you don't have to only sail through smooth seas. You can still navigate even when the weather's choppy and the water's choppy, and maybe even enjoy the sail in the process. So that's probably too many metaphors, right? I did a whole lot of mixing. There's a lot of nautical talk in there, but really, let's get back to what I was wondering at the very beginning. How do we thrive? Not just survive, not just live, not just show up every day, but how do we thrive in the messy middle that is life? According to all the wellness stuff I've learned over the years and trainings on happiness and how to be a better parent and how to be joyful and how to be mindful, there are some common protective factors to keep us from getting buried under the sadness and the darkness of life. There's connection with others. There's engaging in renewing activities. There's celebrating small wins, the glimmers, if you will, that we talked about before with Allison. And then there's helping other people. There's focusing on other people and their needs. I know that's what helped me through after the storm. Things were awful here. I didn't have, my kids were sleeping in the same bed in full hats, coats, everything else, because we had no power, and suddenly it decided it needed to be winter. And we went from like 70 one day to 39 the next day with full snow on the ground. And I'm, chuckling now, but I remember being really terrified then. And so in those first early days, we did what we could to control the situation in front of us because we had zero control over anything else that was happening. In the later days, when my kids got a little bit of normalcy back, when we were, when we had some power restored. So a few weeks in, when we had power restored, when my kids were back, I still remember having like a pit in my stomach of like, this devastation's not over. My kids have some routine back in their lives, but there's a whole lot of kids that don't. And I went to work in other places. I started, helping people clean out. I started helping people organize donations. I started doing whatever I could physically to help other people. And quite selfishly, that helped me. So that idea of focusing on others, and not necessarily with worse situations than you, but just other people that need help, can help us through those dark times too. Just like all the other ones, celebrating the glimmers, engaging in renewing activities, connecting with others. In my helpful days, I was also connecting with fellow volunteers and with people who were trying to share their stories about what had happened. So those things, trying to help incorporate those into your lives, focusing on other people, celebrating small wins, engaging in things that renew you, and then connecting with other people. All of those things can be helpful in navigating the ups and downs of life, in making sure you don't get stuck in the down part, but also can find some peace and joy for yourself when things are otherwise kind of messy. And I would add one thing, and that's taking the time to tune in and accept whatever it is you're feeling without any judgment. After the storm here, I've just said, we didn't have the total devastation that some others did. It wasn't great, but it also wasn't something that lasted years and years and years for us. It lasted a few weeks, and then we were able to go and help other people. That time could have been fraught with guilt over feeling fill in the blank. I could have felt guilty that my kids did get to go back to school. I could have felt guilty that all we lost was power. I could have felt, sad that they missed Halloween. Let's put it, that's one thing that happened. My kids missed Halloween. I could have then punished myself for feeling sad about my kids missing Halloween because other kids had it so much worse. It was widespread, the aftermath of the storm. And so I have the propensity, and I think a lot of humans do, to look around and compare and say, oh, well, mine's not as bad as theirs, so I shouldn't get to feel bad about it. And also, if I feel good, that makes me feel guilty because they don't get to feel good. And so I'm adding to this piece of resilience, accepting without judgment whatever it is you're feeling. If it's joy, if it's sadness, if it's frustration, if it's anger, if it's love and warmth, that's it. Full stop. It doesn't matter what you're feeling in comparison to someone else. And it doesn't matter if you think you are, quote unquote, allowed to feel it. So often, the expectations we have for ourselves are that we either don't feel at all, or we're not allowed to feel one or the other. We can't feel good if someone else has it bad, and we can't feel bad if someone else has it worse. Sometimes things are hard and unfair in our lives, and it doesn't matter what everybody else is feeling. They're just hard and unfair for us, and we are allowed to feel that way. In addition, sometimes we can be happy and grateful for what we have, even though somebody else is struggling. It doesn't take away from either one. You are not, by saying I'm grateful, you are not saying that I think those people deserve what they got. By saying I found a glimmer, you're not belittling the tragedy or the trials. You're just hanging on to that glimmer as a way of saying there's more to it than this. Sometimes not sometimes, always, there is no reason to judge or to shame or to feel guilty about any of the things that we are experiencing and feeling in the moment. Quite frankly, there's no reason to do it for anybody else either. Because sometimes things can be really good right in the middle of something really bad, and that's okay. And sometimes we can feel really bad about something that in the grand scheme of things isn't that big a deal. And that's okay too. We can feel good in the messy middle, and we are allowed to feel bad about our own stuff, no matter what. Two things can exist at the same time in our lives. We can feel bad and someone might have it worse. And we can feel good even though things aren't great elsewhere. Those two things can all be true. So looking for the glimmers does not erase the muck, and being happy in the face of great sadness isn't you failing to honor the sadness. It's really just you honoring yourself, choosing that resilience, choosing that lifeline, choosing to allow all of it in, not just one or the other. So I wonder if we can find wonder in the messy middle of life. I think we can. I do think there is wonder in the weeds. We just have to give ourselves permission to find it. Thanks for listening. Can't wait to see you next week. Take care.